something that needs to be addressed on the Honda is the CV joints and the axles. So nowadays, for the most part, when in doubt, chuck it out. You can actually buy brand new CV joints on axle, the entire assembly, fairly cheap. It's really economical. So there's no point in trying to replace and repair the old ones when brand new ones, quality brand new ones, are dirt cheap. But me being a cheapskate, I've decided to try and reuse the originals. Now, the first thing you want to think is, are the originals reusable? Are they still good? The general rule of thumb with CV joints is, if they're not clicking, leave them alone. They're fine. All right? You want to inspect the boots and make sure that they're not ripped. So if they are ripped, like this one, which is completely destroyed, ripped all the way through, all the way around. So with this one, you want to clean it out and replace the boot. They're actually relatively easy to remove and replace. It's quite surprising. You can pop them out of the transmission just with a lever or a screwdriver, and just they pop out that easy. There's not that much to it. And I've seen guys use all kinds of mechanisms to try and force these things on. You don't need to do that. There's a much easier way. So whether or not you replace your CV joints and your boots, when to do it and when not to do it. So generally speaking, if it's not clicking, leave it alone. If the boots are ripped, but it's not clicking, there's no clicking, no noise, no damage to the CV joint itself, yeah, you can probably replace the boot. Just get away with that. Make sure you clean everything out of it. Get all the sand, dirt, grit, anything out of there. Fresh grease. Make sure you use CV joint grease. Very specific to use. You can't just use any old grease. You have to stick in actual CV joint lubricant. And generally speaking with CVs, if you turn a corner and you hear it clicking, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. These things are unbelievably durable and unbelievably over-engineered. They're actually a quality unit. So if you're turning a corner and it clicks, leave it alone. Don't worry about it. Check the boot. If it's ripped, replace it. There you go. If you're driving straight and it's clicking, replace it now. Just replace the whole thing. Just take the entire damn thing out and throw it away and get some new ones. And they're so easy to replace. But in this case, I'm actually going to replace just the rubber boots on here. I'm going to show you how it's done. So only replacing the rubber boots. Now I remember when driving this car, it didn't click, it didn't make any grinding sounds, any noise. I'm looking inside, I'm not seeing any dirt, grit, or sand or anything inside. I'm still going to clean it thoroughly, re-grease it, and replace this boot while everything's apart. It just makes sense to do it now rather than put it back together like this. So replacing the boots on these things is relatively easy. They actually sell you specialized tools that can help you press the boots on and all kinds of expensive funky. You don't need any of these funky tools and these other things. Honestly, the only tool you need for replacing the boots on a CV joint is this one right here. Okay? KD tool 3191. That's it. It's the only tool you need. Specialty tool. You also need a hammer, side cutters, maybe a screwdriver, basic hand tools. There's not that much to it. Now, what you want to do is first you want to remove the CV joint and then check it for wear inside. Clean out all the grease because the grease can actually hold sand. Sand and metal don't mix. The sand will just grind into the CV joints and cause premature wear. First, we got to remove the old boot. And literally they are just held on with these silly little straps. They're almost like zip ties, just about, but only they don't zip. You actually have to use that special KD tool in order to fold them over and have them lock. Do not use hosing clamps or spring clamps or anything else. Those will come off, they will not get tight enough, And actually a hosing clamp will then have the clamp portion on one side, which will actually cause the entire axle shaft to vibrate really badly as you're driving down the road. It feels like your wheel is shaking. Don't use hosing clamps. You're better off with nothing and just allowing the CV joint to get full of sand, wear out, and replace the entire axle than you are putting on a hosing clamp. I'm cheap, but don't be that cheap. Some drive shafts will actually come with this portion right here. This is actually like a vibrational dampener. Leave this alone. Don't move it, don't touch it, don't try and adjust it. Just leave it alone. It's there for a reason. So only remove the boot. Just that easy. As for this portion, nice little blade. Make sure it's a good sharp blade, and don't cut yourself doing this. So cut away from yourself and cut down. And there you go. Okay, now to remove the CV joint from the drive shaft. This is actually very simple. This is all it takes. Yes, you should probably be using a brass hammer and a copper chisel and all these other whatever. This is an old drive shaft out of a God knows what, and this is, well, a ball-peen hammer. Whatever. And there you go. It's quite literally that easy. So now that you've got it off, you want to check inside for any damage to the universal joint itself. Look for any sand, any grit, any dirt inside. Sometimes the sand can actually be hidden inside the grease, so it can look fine, but there could be particles inside there, so you really want to get these nice and clean before you reuse them. I mean, why go through all this hassle of taking it apart, replacing the boot, putting it back in, just to have it wear out in a month? No point. Might as well do this right the first time. Alright, so now we're going to reinstall the CV joint back onto the drive shaft with the new boot. First, we have to grease the CV joints before installation and prepare everything for install. Prior to installation, don't forget to put the boot on first before the CV joint, otherwise taking this whole thing apart was kind of pointless. Now everything has been cleaned, drive shaft has been repainted, everything is now ready. The CV joints have to be greased with proper CV joint lubricant that comes supplied with the kit. Make sure you use the proper CV joint lube. Don't use whatever happens to be laying around. It has to be the correct stuff. You want this to last, otherwise why are you taking it apart? Why are you wasting your time taking the CV joint apart if you're just going to lube it up with whatever? Maybe stuff some banana peels in there, I don't know. But make sure you use the correct CV joint that comes with the boot, and now we can reinstall and reassemble. Before you go reassembling the CV joint and everything else, first put the boot on. Very important. It just slips right on there. Real easy. First, before assembly, I wanted to show you something right here. See this little lock ring? Make sure you have this lock ring in place before you reassemble the CV joint, and use the original one that came with your drive shaft. Some of these kits will come with aftermarket ones. The aftermarket ones can be either too big, too small, don't want to stay in place, will slip off. you want that little lock ring in there. So use the original one if you can. And when reassembling, the little trick to reassembling the CV joints, what you want to do, see these two little ends? So when you're pressing the CV joint back down onto the splines, you want to take a screwdriver and just make sure to push these little ends into the CV joint, and then you'll be able to tap the CV joint on really nice and easy. If you don't do this, you're going to have to wind up hitting the CV joint really hard, and of course the CV joint on top of the shaft has little threads for the locking nut. You damage those, you're done. You might as well have just bought a new one and just be done with it. But if you do this correctly and you push these in, the CV joint will actually pop on really nice and easy, and Bob's your uncle. Now I'm going to try and get a close-up here as best I can to try and show this. Hopefully this will work. Now, just gotta make sure you know where those little clips are. Now, like I was saying, these threads right here, you need to be very careful. You don't want to flare this out at the top. You don't want to damage any of these threads. Otherwise, you may as well have just thrown this out in the first place and just simply bought a new one. So be very careful. Kid gloves with these threads up here. As long as you do that, now, ball joint is in place. All you have to do is lock the boot on. We'll be doing that next. Okay, now next, we're going to install the boot. Now, if you notice here, the boot has multiple grooves in it. Here, 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 here. That's because these boots are actually made for multiple applications, sort of a universal fit. Not just for the Honda, the Toyota, whatever. They're made for anything that uses a CV joint. Which is fine, because all you do is find which groove works for your particular application and trim off the rest. Alright, so now you just take some pliers. Any old pliers will do, it doesn't matter which ones. And what you're going to do is pull the boot up until you hit the groove that you want. Now, prior to installation, I checked to see which groove it was, and I saw these top grooves were a little too big. This one right here fit like a glove, and I noticed when I fit the CV joint into the boot, that was prior to putting it on the axle, and I went to press on the boot itself, the boot would actually hold air. So that means the seal at the top was so tight it was actually holding air, right? So then that means if it holds air, it's going to hold grease. And if it holds grease, it's not going to allow sand, dirt, and grit inside, which is the point of the boot. So wrestling with this greasy, slimy, slippery rubber boot, trying to fit it on there, it can be a bit of a challenge. It seems to want to slide around quite a bit. But once you get it up to the correct height, so that inside there's a little bit of a lip, so you just have to get it up over that lip, and now you're ready to install the lock ring. These lock rings are very similar to a zip strap, just without the zip. So you actually have to put the lock ring on, zip it, use your 3191 KD tool, and lock the ring on place. Once locked in place, it will not move, it will not slip, it will not come off. Then you do the same thing to the bottom. Now when installing this boot, only worry about the top groove first, the bottom groove second. The bottom groove will just automatically kind of position itself, so don't worry too much about this one. Once it finds its natural position, you simply lock it in there. Bob's your uncle. So it's real simple. You just tighten up the nut on the tool, fold it over, and now you're locked in place. So once you're happy with where the locking ring is, pull out this piece. Now you can pull off the tool and fold it over the rest of the way. You'll see two little retaining tabs. Those tabs have to be folded over in order to lock the ring in place. Once you've got the retaining strap where you want it, cut off the excess. Now, make sure you're happy that the boot is locked in place correctly. And now the rest of this boot can simply be trimmed off. Just trim off the excess, and make sure when you're doing this you use a nice sharp knife. There's nothing more dangerous than a dull knife. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you will. And for the bottom one, just let it set up naturally wherever it wants to lay and strap it there the exact same way you did this one. Same thing on the bottom.